Life isn't always fair. Sometimes you walk into a place where people judge you solely by your skin color or appearance and quickly decide you don't belong here. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of a young woman, Ava Johnson, who simply wanted a peaceful flight home. But because of the color of her skin, she was humiliated, denied her first class seat, and cast aside in front of countless strangers. Did she back down? No, she stood her ground, not by shouting, not through anger, but with dignity, composure, and the power of patience. But the most unexpected twist? That girl was the daughter of the airline's owner. What really happened on that flight? And what lesson was learned from prejudices that seemed impossible to change? Stay with me for this emotional story. If you believe that everyone deserves respect, hit the subscribe button to help spread this powerful message. Los Angeles International Airport was bustling as usual. Electronic boards flashing flight information, loudspeakers constantly announcing departures, and streams of travelers dragging their luggage through security checkpoints. Amidst this rush of people, Ava Johnson walked with quiet confidence. The 19-year-old had a head full of natural curls and wore a simple pair of jeans paired with a navy bomber jacket. Everything about her radiated elegance without trying too hard. Ava was on her way home after 2 years of studying in New York. She had just completed a prestigious academic program and secured an internship offer from a major corporation. This flight wasn't just a journey back home, it was a symbolic milestone in her life. In her hand was a first class ticket, not a luxury gift, but something she rightfully deserved. She wheeled her suitcase toward the first class check in counter, where a group of passengers stood calmly in line. There was no rush, no pushing. Everyone carried the air of those accustomed to privilege. When it was Ava's turn, she handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant. Linda Parker, a middle-aged woman with neatly tied hair and a pristine uniform, greeted her with a polite but distant smile. Her eyes, however, scanned Ava from head to toe in that filled with subtle scrutiny. "Excuse me, I think you might be in the wrong line. Economy class is over there," Linda said, her tone polite but cool. Ava blinked, glancing down at her ticket to make sure she hadn't made a mistake. "No, I have a first-class ticket," she said calmly, holding out her pass again. Linda glanced at it briefly, narrowing her eyes as if still unconvinced. "Hmm, there might be some mistake." "Please wait a moment," she said, though she made no effort to verify it. People in line began to take notice. A well-dressed, middle-aged man standing behind Ava raised his eyebrows. "She has a first-class ticket," he spoke up. Linda forced a stiff smile. "I'm just double-checking. We need to ensure everyone is in the correct place." Ava felt a tightness in her chest. She wasn't naive. She had seen situations like this before, but this time she was the target. She knew exactly why Linda was acting this way. "I suggest you check it right now because I don't intend to stand here all day," Ava said, keeping her voice composed but firm. Linda pressed her lips together before reluctantly scanning Ava's pass. The beep confirmed it. First class. There was no room for doubt. Yet, Linda couldn't hide her displeasure. "All right, seat 2A. Have a pleasant flight," she said, but the forced tone betrayed her true feelings. As Ava stepped forward, she felt the weight of the passengers' stares. Some were curious, others seemed to side with Linda, and a few cast looks of pity. She took a deep breath, reminding herself not to let their judgment affect her. Entering the first-class cabin was like stepping into another world. Spacious leather seats, soft lighting, and even a small bar exuded luxury. Ava placed her luggage in the overhead compartment, sat down in her seat, and exhaled softly. At least the first barrier was over, but she had no idea. The real battle was just about to begin. Linda Parker entered the first-class cabin a few minutes later. She wasn't alone. Two security officers followed closely behind her. "Excuse me, Miss Johnson," Linda said, her tone firmer this time. "We need to check your ticket again. There seems to be an issue with your seat assignment." Ava narrowed her eyes. "I believe we already confirmed that at the gate." Linda crossed her arms, forcing a polite yet obviously insincere smile. "I'm afraid there may have been a system error. Would you mind standing up for a moment so we can verify?" Silence settled over the first-class cabin. A few passengers glanced over, pretending to ignore the situation but unable to hide their curiosity. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken. Humiliation crept into her chest with every breath. She had two choices: comply or stand her ground. stand her ground. She chose the latter. Ava looked directly at Linda, and this time her voice was no longer just polite. I don't need to stand up just because you assume I don't belong here. I have a valid ticket. If you have an issue with that, maybe you should reassess yourself. A small ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in approval, while others appeared irritated by the commotion. Linda took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure, but it was obvious. She wasn't used to being challenged. Miss Johnson, if you do not cooperate, we will have to ask security to escort you elsewhere. Ava gripped the armrest tightly. She knew this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was a test. She pulled out her phone, opened her messages, and typed a simple line. Dad, they're trying to kick me out of first class. She hit send, and then she waited. Linda remained standing, her eyes locked onto Ava's, daring her to back down. But Ava knew. Time was not on Linda's side. Hundreds of miles away, Michael Johnson, her father, the owner of the very airline she was flying on, had just received her message, and when he took action, everything was about to change forever. Ava Johnson remained seated in her first-class seat, but her body was tense, like a coiled spring. Her phone screen was still lit, displaying the message she had just sent to her father. In front of her, Linda Parker stood with her arms crossed, eyes cold and sharp. Her lips were pressed tightly together, as if silently declaring, "You won't get away from me." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavy. Other passengers pretended to be uninterested, but everyone was sneaking glances. Some seemed annoyed by the disturbance, while others showed signs of disapproval. Especially Robert, the middle-aged man who had previously defended Ava at the boarding gate. He leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Are you okay?" Ava gave a small nod, though her heart was racing. She had never imagined finding herself in a situation like this. She had always preferred to stay low-key, never wanting anyone to know she was the daughter of Michael Johnson, the founder and CEO of the largest airline corporation in the United States. She was proud of her father, a self-made man who built his empire from nothing, but he had also taught her the value of humility. He had told her never to rely on their family's power. Today, she had tried to follow that principle, but it seemed things were spiraling out of control. Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice, but increasing the pressure in her tone. "Miss Johnson, this is my final request. We need you to move to the economy section. This is protocol. I don't want to escalate this, but if necessary, I will call security." Ava tightened her grip on her phone. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, but she showed no fear. Her eyes met Linda's with unwavering determination. "I'm not moving anywhere. I paid for this seat. If you think I don't belong here just because I don't look like the passengers you're used to, that's your problem, not mine." Ava's bluntness caught Linda off guard for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered her icy composure. "I'm sorry, but I don't have time for arguments. Stand up now." And then, as if to pour fuel on the fire, two security officers entered the first-class cabin. One was a tall, muscular man wearing dark sunglasses. The other was younger, with a stern expression etched on his face. Linda turned toward them, her voice authoritative and commanding. "This is a non-compliant passenger. She's occupying a seat she's not entitled to. Please escort her to the economy section." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Blood rushed to Ava's face. She couldn't believe she was being treated like a violator, just because this woman believed a black girl didn't belong in first class. "Wait a minute." Robert's voice rang out again, louder this time. "I saw her present her ticket at the gate. It's clearly first class. You can't treat her like this." Linda whipped around, her eyes sharp as daggers. "Sir, this is an airline matter. If you don't want to be removed from the plane for causing a disturbance, I suggest you stay seated." Robert froze, his lips pressed tightly together. He lowered his voice but couldn't hide his anger. Ava glanced at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but she knew. Right now, her only real hope was her father. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Michael appeared. "Handling it. Stay calm." Ava took a deep breath. Her father knew, and when he said he was handling it, she understood. Everything was about to change. But for now, she still had to face Linda and the two security officers who were looking at her as though she didn't belong. The older security officer stepped forward. Miss, we kindly ask for your cooperation so we can ensure the flight proceeds smoothly. Ava looked up at him, her eyes firm and unwavering. I'm not going anywhere. This is my seat. If you need to check anything, check your system. Don't treat me like I'm in the wrong just because I don't match her idea of a first-class passenger. The three people standing before her hesitated. Linda opened her mouth, ready to say something, but just then the cabin speaker crackled to life. Lead flight attendant Linda Parker, please report to the cockpit immediately. The tension shifted. Linda froze, her face slightly drained of color, though she tried to maintain her composure. Leave her here. I'll handle it later, Linda told the security officers before turning sharply and walking away. Her high heels clacked loudly against the floor, each step tense and deliberate. Ava let out a quiet breath of relief, but she stayed on guard. She knew this was only a pause. The real battle was still ongoing, but this time she wasn't facing it alone. Her father was now in the fight. Inside the cockpit, Linda Parker stood before Captain Richard Holden, a seasoned pilot in his 50s with a stern, authoritative presence. He placed his phone down after a brief call with Michael Johnson. His gaze scanned Linda, his eyes filled with scrutiny. I just received a call from Mr. Michael Johnson, the captain said slowly, his voice heavy with authority. He owns this airline, and the passenger in seat 2A is his daughter. Linda froze. The blood drained from her face. She stammered, I didn't know. That doesn't matter, the captain cut her off. What matters is that you made the owner's daughter feel humiliated and discriminated against. Mr. Johnson has instructed you to ensure she is treated with the utmost care for the remainder of the flight, and I strongly suggest you do exactly that if you wish to keep your job. Linda stood motionless, the confidence and superiority she had built over 20 years evaporating in an instant. For the first time in her career, she felt true fear. Understood? The captain pressed. Yes, understood, Linda muttered softly. She turned and left the cockpit. The sound of her heels was no longer sharp and commanding. Each step was heavy and shaky, burdened with the weight of what was to come. Ava sat quietly, gazing out the window, when Linda returned to the first-class cabin. She approached Ava, forcing an awkward smile. Miss Johnson, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience earlier. We will ensure you receive the best service for the rest of the flight. Would you like some orange juice or champagne? Ava looked at her eyes calm but cold. No, thank you, she said firmly. Linda nodded and stepped back, but Ava knew this was far from over. A much bigger storm awaited Linda when the plane landed. Ava leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and let a faint smile form on her lips. Justice was coming, and this time, she wouldn't face it alone. The Boeing 787 glided through the clouds, with the sunset painting the sky in a brilliant shade of orange. The first-class cabin remained quiet, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Linda Parker hovered around the service station, trying to appear busy, but everyone could see the nervousness in her every movement. A young flight attendant, Kelly, glanced at her cautiously. She had heard whispers of what had happened and knew that a storm was about to break. Ava Johnson sat still in her seat, resting her head against the window. Her eyes gazed outward, but her mind replayed the events of the day. She knew Linda was afraid, but that didn't erase the fact that Linda had deliberately humiliated her in front of dozens of onlookers. Her phone vibrated. A new message from her father, Michael Johnson. When the plane lands, stay in your seat. I'll be waiting at the gate. This will be handled. Ava exhaled softly. She wasn't someone who sought attention, but this time, she knew she had to face it. Linda slowly approached Ava, holding a glass of orange juice on a tray. Her smile was stiff and forced. Miss Johnson, I am truly sorry for the earlier misunderstanding. I hope we can move past this, Linda said, her voice low but loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Ava looked up at her. Maybe it was just her imagination, but she couldn't detect any sincerity in Linda's tone. There was only fear and desperation. Ava didn't need hollow apologies, and she certainly wasn't the one who would decide how this ended. I don't think that's up to me anymore, Ava replied calmly, her words laced with meaning. Linda swallowed hard. That response cut through the last sliver of hope she was clinging to. As the plane began its descent, some passengers adjusted their seats while others stretched in preparation for landing. But there was an unspoken tension in the first-class cabin. Everyone sensed that this wasn't over. Linda Parker made her way to the cockpit, lightly knocking before stepping inside. Captain Richard Holden was reviewing the final approach checklist. He didn't bother looking up as she stood before him. "Captain, I can explain," Linda began, her voice trembling. Captain Holden looked up, his gaze cold and unwavering. "There's nothing to explain. Once we land, you'll accompany the airline's executive waiting at the gate. He will handle your dismissal." Linda froze, as if paralyzed. "Captain, please. I've worked here for 20 years. The captain leaned forward slightly. His voice was not loud, but the weight behind his words made Linda feel as though the ground beneath her was giving way. "You've worked for 20 years, but one thoughtless action cost you everything." Linda wanted to argue, to defend herself. She hadn't meant to discriminate. She hadn't known Ava was the owner's daughter. But deep down, she knew none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had allowed her prejudice to dictate how she treated a passenger. And now she had to pay the price. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway. Passengers stirred, reaching for their carry-ons. Some glanced toward Ava with admiration, while others whispered quietly, speculating about what was about to unfold. Ava remained in her seat as her father had instructed. There was no rush. She knew that once she stepped off this plane, a new chapter would begin, not only for her, but also for Linda Parker. Outside the aircraft door, Michael Johnson was already waiting. He wore a sharp gray suit, but it was his piercing gaze that commanded attention. Beside him stood two senior executives from the airline, along with a few other high-ranking staff members. Linda stepped off the plane, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes flicked toward Michael Johnson, but quickly darted away. She couldn't summon the courage to meet his stare. Michael didn't need to say much. His eyes conveyed everything. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "What you did on this flight was unacceptable, and you will be held accountable." Linda opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She swallowed hard instead. Michael turned to the two executives. "Effective immediately, Linda Parker is no longer an employee of this airline." One of the executives nodded and handed Linda a sealed envelope containing her termination papers. "You may gather your belongings and leave once you've completed the formalities," he said. Linda's face went pale. The composure she had worn for over 20 years as a senior flight attendant had vanished. Passengers from first class began to file out, some pausing to watch the scene unfold. Robert, the man who had defended Ava during the flight, passed by and nodded respectfully to Michael. "Mr. Johnson, I saw everything. You did the right thing." Michael gave a slight nod in acknowledgement. Then his gaze shifted to his daughter. "Ava, are you all right?" Ava took a deep breath, feeling the fresh airport air filling her lungs. She smiled softly. "I'm okay." She didn't need someone to suffer for her. But today, justice had been served, and that was enough. A few weeks later, a news story spread rapidly across the media. Johnson Airlines CEO announces new anti-discrimination training policy for airline staff. Michael Johnson stood at a press conference, his voice calm yet resolute. "No matter who you are, where you come from, or the color of your skin, when you board one of our planes, you deserve to be treated with respect. There will be no exceptions." Ava read the article and smiled quietly to herself. She knew that, in the end, this was not just her story. It was the story of millions who had faced unfair treatment. And if today a small change could make a difference, then it was all worth it. Ava stood up, grabbed her suitcase, and headed for the door. She had another flight to catch, this time with the belief that the world could indeed be a better place. 3 months after the incident on that fateful flight, the name Linda Parker had all but vanished from the airline industry. Former colleagues spoke of her in hushed tones, as if referring to someone who had crossed a line and could never return. There were no more friendly texts, no calls about work opportunities, not even casual coffee invites. The world she once belonged to had shut its doors, coldly and decisively. Life after her dismissal was anything but easy. She had once overseen the first-class cabin, commanding luxury flights with authority. Now she sat alone in a small suburban apartment, staring at her computer screen, faced with rejection after rejection. Every airline had heard about what happened. No matter how she tried to conceal it, the stain of prejudice, and her mistake clung to her. The firm handshakes she once exchanged had been replaced by cold, impersonal emails. Thank you for your application, but we have found a more suitable candidate. Linda confined herself within the walls of her home, occasionally turning on the TV just to kill time. Then, one day, a familiar name echoed from the screen. Michael Johnson, the renowned CEO of Johnson Airlines, was being interviewed on national television. He spoke about a sweeping reform in customer service standards across the airline industry. His airline had introduced training programs on respect, diversity, and eliminating bias. His initiatives had not only transformed his company, but also inspired rival airlines to follow suit. The interviewer praised Michael not just for how he handled the incident, but for turning it into a catalyst for meaningful change. But what made Linda's hands tremble and her eyes well up was the moment the camera shifted to Ava Johnson, the very girl she had humiliated that day. Ava had been invited to the studio. Her face was radiant, though her signature calmness remained. When asked about her experience, she didn't attack Linda. She simply said, "It was a difficult day, but I believe anyone can make a mistake. What matters is whether they're willing to change." Linda sat frozen, her hands shaking, eyes stinging with tears. She had never expected such grace. She had braced herself for hatred and condemnation, but instead she was offered something far more powerful: a chance. However faint, it was still a chance. Late one evening, Linda opened her laptop. She began typing an email to Johnson Airlines, not with any hope of getting her job back, but simply to apologize. This time, the words came from her heart. She admitted that she had allowed prejudice to cloud her judgment, that she had hurt someone out of pride and narrow-mindedness. At the end of the email, she wrote, "I don't ask for forgiveness. I only hope Miss Ava knows that I am truly sorry. And if there is any chance someday, I would be grateful for an opportunity to make things right." She hit send and stared blankly at the screen. She expected nothing, but in simply writing those words and being honest with herself, she felt a small sense of release. A week later, when her phone rang, Linda was shocked to hear it was a call from Johnson Airlines' HR department. "We've received your email. Mr. Johnson would like to meet with you." Her heart pounded. She arrived at the company headquarters feeling like a person who had lost everything. But Michael Johnson greeted her with a calm expression. He did not scold her. He did not humiliate her. He simply said, "I believe in holding people accountable for their mistakes, but I also believe in second chances. You will be allowed to return, but under strict probation. If you truly want to make amends, show it through your actions." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes. For the first time in months, she felt seen, not as a failure, but as a human being. On her first day back at work, Linda walked past her old colleagues. Some gave her polite nods, others whispered quietly. But no one treated her with hatred. The training programs Michael had introduced had changed the environment. People had learned to be open-minded instead of judgmental. Linda worked harder than ever before. She was careful, diligent, and most importantly, sincere. Every time she served a passenger, she looked them in the eyes and smiled warmly. First-class seats were no longer symbols of status to her. They were simply seats for people, all of whom deserved respect. One day, during a flight, Linda unexpectedly saw Ava Johnson again. Ava was seated in 2A, carrying the same calm aura as before. When Linda approached to serve her, she paused for a moment, then gave a small bow. "Miss Johnson, thank you." Ava looked up, slightly surprised, but then smiled. "It's good to see you again." A simple exchange, but for Linda, it felt like true redemption. At an aviation service conference, Michael Johnson stood before hundreds of attendees, sharing the story of Ava and Linda as a powerful example of change. When we make mistakes, punishment is not the only answer. What matters is offering a chance to make things right. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means giving someone the opportunity to become better. In the audience, Linda sat quietly, listening. She knew she had made a mistake, but she also knew she hadn't wasted her second chance, and she would never let it slip away again. Beside Michael, Ava sat looking down at the stage. She understood that not everyone deserved forgiveness, but sometimes it was forgiveness itself that made the world just a little bit better. That flight, with all the turbulence it brought, had finally led them all to a new sky, one that was clearer, fairer, and filled with hope. That flight landed safely, but the echoes of what happened on board continued to resonate. Linda Parker, the once proud flight attendant, lost everything because of her own prejudice, but in the end, she chose to make things right. Ava Johnson, the young woman who was humiliated, chose forgiveness and grace. And Michael Johnson, a father and a leader, proved that justice is not just about punishment, it is also about giving someone a second chance to rebuild. Together, they found each other under a new sky, a sky where every person, regardless of background, color, or status, is treated with dignity and respect. What do you think? Did Linda deserve forgiveness? Have you ever been judged unfairly because of your appearance? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so we can continue spreading more inspiring stories like this one. Because where there is respect, there is justice. See you in the next story.